The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, and the words on it made no sense at first. Commandant's Augustus is gone. The words sat flat and impossible on the paper. The man who had walked barefoot through the Himalayan passes in the dead of winter. The man who had been left for dead in a pit outside Rasar and had somehow climbed out before dawn. The man who had sat across from lamas and generals and dying prisoners and spoken to each of them as though they were the only person in the world. Gone. That was how most people first heard the name Augustus Clement Farrow, not through his lifetime, but through his disappearance. A footnote, a mystery, a man the world forgot before it ever truly knew him. But if you take the time to sit with his story, really sit with it, something begins to happen inside you. Something you didn't expect and can't quite explain. He was born in 1880 in a small town outside Hamilton, Ontario. Not a dramatic birth, not a portentous night. His mother, a quiet woman named Dorothy, recorded the date in a leather Bible she had received as a wedding gift. His father worked at a foundry and came home each evening smelling of iron and coal smoke. There were 5 children in the Farrow house, and Augustus, called Gus by everyone who knew him, was the middle one. Neither the firstborn with a destiny to fulfill, nor the youngest with everyone's indulgence. Just the middle. He was a restless boy. Teachers liked him because he was sharp, then grew exasperated because he wouldn't sit still. His father liked him because he worked hard, then grew frustrated because he asked too many questions. Why is the fire that color? Why do people get sick and die? Why does God let them? His mother was the only one who didn't seem bothered by the questions. She would pause in whatever she was doing, set down the cloth or the pot and say, "I don't know, Gus. But I think you're meant to find out." He didn't know what that meant when he was 8. He didn't know what it meant when he was 12 either. But by then he had read the entire Bible twice, not out of piety, but out of the same compulsive hunger that made him take apart clocks to see what was inside. He wanted to understand the mechanism, what made it run, what made people run. The town where he grew up was Presbyterian in the way that most small Ontario towns were Presbyterian in those years, respectably, quietly, without much fire. The church was a good building. The sermons were sensible. God was orderly and distant and unlikely to do anything that would embarrass anyone. Gus sat in the pew every Sunday beside his mother and felt beneath the respectability and the good woodwork a kind of hollow, like there should have been more. He couldn't have told you what more meant. He just knew that the God described on Sunday mornings seemed smaller than the one he read about at night. The God who spoke to Moses from a burning bush. The God who opened the Red Sea and rained bread from the sky and raised dry bones back into an army. That God seemed like he had retired somewhere between Malachi and Matthew, and nobody was particularly interested in discussing it. Gus was 17 when something happened that would reroute everything. His younger sister, Catherine, fell ill in the spring of 1897. What began as a cough became something worse. The doctor came twice, then a third time, and the look on his face the third time was different from the first 2. Gus stood in the hallway and watched through the crack of the door as his mother pressed her knuckle to her mouth to keep from making a sound. He prayed that night on the floor of his room. Not a church prayer, not the careful, formal kind he had been taught. Something ragged and desperate. He said things to God that he hadn't known he believed until they came out. He told God that if Catherine died, he didn't think he could keep pretending that any of it was real. He told God that he needed to know. He needed to know if there was someone actually there. He fell asleep on the floor sometime before dawn. In the morning, Catherine's fever had broken. The doctor came again and found her sitting up in bed asking for porridge. Now, you can call that coincidence. You can call it the natural course of an illness. Gus himself spent years turning it over, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the seam where the natural explanation fit. He never could, not to his own satisfaction. Something had been answered that night, and it had changed the shape of everything that came after. He was not the same young man after that spring. He left Hamilton at 22 with $40, a worn Bible, and a letter of introduction to a mission society in Toronto that a minister friend had written for him. His father shook his hand at the door and said very little, which was the way men of that generation expressed things they couldn't bring themselves to say out loud. His mother held him for a long time, longer than she usually did, and when she finally let go, her eyes were dry, but only barely. The Mission Society in Toronto was a cramped building on a street that smelled of horses and coal. The director, a thin Scotsman named Caldwell, looked at Gus over his spectacles and asked him 3 questions. First, what languages did he speak? Second, did he have any medical training? Third, had he ever been to China? No, and no. Caldwell set down his pen. He said there was work in northern India, difficult work. The society had lost 2 men there already, one to typhoid, one to reasons they didn't fully understand. The region was high altitude, cold beyond what most Canadians imagined when they thought of India, and the people were suspicious of outsiders in ways that made most mission work almost impossible. Did Gus have any particular qualifications for that kind of environment? Gus thought about it. He said, "I don't get cold easily, and I'm hard to discourage." Caldwell almost smiled. He said, that was, at minimum, a start. The journey from Hamilton to the Himalayan foothills took 6 weeks in 1902. A train to Halifax, a ship to England, another ship to Bombay, a train north. Then a series of increasingly smaller conveyances as the roads narrowed and the air thinned, and the mountains filled up more and more of the sky until there was almost nothing else. Gus arrived in the village of Kotgar in the autumn and immediately understood why the society had struggled there. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was indifference of a very particular kind. The kind that has seen outsiders come and go for so long that it no longer registers them as a surprise or a threat. He was simply another white man with a bag and a book, and the village had a long memory for people like that. The missionary who was supposed to brief him, a man named Forsyth, had left 3 months prior with what was described in the Society's letter as a crisis of faith, but which Gus would later learn was, more specifically, a crisis of nerve. The house Forsyth had occupied was cold and smelled of damp. There was a small stove, a cot, a table with 3 legs that worked and one that didn't, and a view of the mountains that, on the clearest mornings, made Gus feel as though he were looking at something that belonged to another order of reality entirely. He spent the first 2 months making mistakes, language mistakes, cultural mistakes, theological mistakes. He tried to explain things in ways that made sense to him, and that meant nothing to the people he was explaining them to. He tried to be helpful in ways that came across as patronizing. He tried to be humble in ways that came across as suspicious. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being surrounded by people who regard you with polite bewilderment, and Gus felt it fully in those early months. On more than one occasion he sat in his tilting house at night and seriously considered writing to Caldwell and saying that there had been a misunderstanding, that he wasn't the right person for this, that perhaps Caldwell should look for someone more qualified. He never sent those letters. He wrote them sometimes, then read them over in the morning light and felt something stiffen in him. He wasn't sure if it was pride or faith or stubbornness, and he suspected it was probably all 3 woven together in a way that couldn't be separated. What changed things was not a sermon. It was not a grand moment of theological argument won, or a miraculous healing, or a crowd moved to tears. What changed things was a woman named Parvati. She was perhaps 60, though in that high-altitude light it was difficult to tell. She had a goiter the size of a fist beneath her jaw, and she walked with a stick, and she had been coming to the edge of the compound twice a week for a month, watching Gus as he worked in the small garden he was trying to establish in the rocky soil, and saying nothing. One morning he brought her tea. He didn't try to convert her or explain anything. He just brought her the tea and sat down near her on the low wall and looked at the mountains with her. She came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the month she had told him, in slow and halting phrases that he pieced together with his improving Hindi and a great deal of guesswork, that her daughter had died the previous winter, and that since then she had found no reason to get out of bed in the morning. She came to the compound, she said, because it was the only place that felt different. He prayed with her that morning, not a prescribed prayer, just words, real ones, about grief and loss and the unbearable weight of an empty house. When they finished, she sat quietly for a long time. Then she said something he would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "Where did you learn to talk to God like that?" Not to impress him, just to talk. He didn't have an answer for her. He had no idea he'd been doing anything different from what he'd always done. But from that morning, something shifted in Khatgar. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. By 1908, Gus had been in India for 6 years. He had learned to read and write in Hindi well enough to correspond with scholars. He had picked up enough of the hill dialects to navigate the villages above Khatgar without a translator. He had built with his own hands, and the reluctant but eventually enthusiastic assistance of several local men, a small structure that served as meeting house, schoolroom, and on bad weather days, a place for people to simply come in from the cold. He had also begun to develop a reputation that he found frankly baffling. People came to him with illnesses. He prayed with them. Sometimes, not always, but often enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence. They got better. He was uncomfortable with this at first, then uncomfortable in a different way when he thought about being uncomfortable with it. If God was real and Gus had staked his entire adult life on the premise that he was, then why should it be strange that God might do things that medicine couldn't account for? He wrote to Caldwell about it carefully. Caldwell wrote back even more carefully. The society was supportive but cautious. There were concerns about encouraging superstition. There were concerns about the reliability of reports from remote areas. There were, Gus noted between the lines, concerns about what the board members in Toronto would think. He filed the letter politely and kept doing what he was doing. One case stayed with him above all others. A boy of perhaps 8 years old, brought to him by his grandfather from a village 3 days' walk to the north. The boy had not spoken in 2 years. No medical explanation the family had encountered accounted for it. He sat in Gus's house and looked at the floor, and the grandfather sat beside him with an expression that Gus recognized. It was the same expression his father had worn, standing outside Catherine's door in 1897, the expression of a person who has run out of practical options and is considering the impractical ones. Gus prayed with the boy. It lasted a long time. He didn't perform anything, didn't shout or make gestures. He simply sat with the boy and spoke quietly, first to God, and then gently to the boy himself, saying things that he couldn't really explain afterward. Something about the boy being seen, being known, being not forgotten even when everything felt like silence. The boy looked up at him partway through, just looked at him. When the grandfather stood to leave, he said something to the boy in the hill dialect. The boy answered, one word, but one word where there had been none for 2 years. The grandfather didn't say anything for a moment. Then he wept in the direct, uncomplicated way that old men weep when they have stopped caring whether anyone sees. Gus stood in the doorway and watched them walk back toward the road and felt something he had no precise word for. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of smallness that was completely different from inadequacy, more like the smallness of standing beside the ocean, an awareness that he was not the source of anything that had just happened. He had simply been present for it. He went back to Canada once, in 1912. 10 years away had made Hamilton feel like a painting of a place he remembered, rather than the place itself. His father had aged in ways that the letters hadn't communicated. His mother was the same, essentially, which was its own kind of relief. Catherine, recovered fully from that long ago illness, now married with 2 children who called Gus the strange uncle from the mountains. He spoke at churches during those months in Canada. Not because he was a gifted public speaker, he wasn't, particularly, but because the society had asked him to, and because he had a rule about not saying no to things simply because they were uncomfortable. He stood in churches that looked a great deal like the one he had sat in as a boy, with the respectable woodwork and the orderly God, and he told stories. Not sermons. Just stories about Parvati and the boy who didn't speak, and the things that happened in the high villages, when people had nothing left to lose and simply asked. He noticed that something happened in those rooms when he talked. Not because of his delivery. His delivery was plain to the point of roughness. But people leaned forward. Something in them reached toward the stories the way a plant reaches toward light. It was as though they were hearing about a God they recognized from somewhere deep down. That was when he understood in a long time. That was when he understood what it was, the hollow he had felt as a boy on the pew. Not doubt. Not unbelief, just longing. They were all longing for something real. He went back to India in 1913 and didn't return to Canada again. The years between 1913 and 1930 were the fullest of his life, and also, at intervals, the hardest. The Great War happened at a remove. He watched its news come through in delayed dispatches, and felt its shadow in the faces of the young men who didn't come to the mission anymore because they had gone to a different kind of calling across the water. He prayed for them all by name, everyone he could remember, into the hills above the compound in the evenings. He never married. This was a subject people felt licensed to raise with him periodically, as though it were an administrative oversight he had simply forgotten to correct. He was never sharp about it. He said that he thought some people were built for that particular kind of love, and some were built for a different kind, and he had simply learned over time which he was. There was a woman once, a Scottish nurse named Marjorie, who worked at the hospital in Simla for 3 years in the early 20s. And between them there had been something that might, in different circumstances, have become something else. But the circumstances were what they were, and Marjorie eventually went home and married a surgeon from Glasgow, and Gus wrote her a sincere letter of congratulations and meant every word of it. What he had instead of a family was an accumulation of people. That is the only honest way to describe it. Hundreds, eventually thousands of individuals who had passed through his life and left something there, or taken something with them, or both. He remembered all of them, kept notes in worn journals that stacked up under his cot over the years. Names, dates, circumstances, not for any formal record. Just because he believed that people deserved to be remembered, the journals were never found. When he disappeared in 1933, somewhere in the high passes between India and Tibet, attempting at the age of 53 a journey to reach a community of Tibetan monks he had been corresponding with for a decade. The journals went with him. No one could say with certainty what happened. The last person to see him was a young Tibetan man named Dawa, who had served as his guide for the first 2 days of the pass. Dawa said that Gus had been in good spirits and that on the morning of the 3rd day he had told Dawa to wait, that he would go ahead alone to make the first contact, as he always did. That it went better, he said, when he came alone. When a person walks toward you by themselves, they seem less like a threat. Dawa waited. Gus didn't come back. A search found nothing. The snow up there is very old and very deep, and it keeps its secrets well. There are people who find this ending unsatisfying, who want a resolution, a body, a confirmed date and cause. That is understandable. We are people who want our stories to close properly. But here is what we know closed. We know that a boy who grew up asking too many questions in a foundry town in Ontario spent 30 years in the Himalayan foothills and changed something. Not with money or power or influence or any of the ordinary currencies. With presence. With prayer that didn't try to impress anyone. With the willingness to show up for person after person after person and say, with his whole life, "You are seen. You are not forgotten." We know that the village of Khatgar had a small building that kept standing long after Gus was gone, and that people kept coming to it. We know that at least one boy who had not spoken did speak, and grew up and had children of his own, and that those children knew the story. We know that an old woman named Parvati found, in the company of a bewildered young Canadian who didn't know how to talk to anyone at first, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. That is not nothing. That is, depending on how you count, everything. There is a question that Gus himself asked repeatedly in those Canadian churches in 1912, and that he recorded in his journals more than once, and that seems now like the truest thing to leave you with. He asked it simply, not dramatically. In the plain, roughened way, he said most things. What would happen, he said, if you stopped waiting to be qualified and simply became available? He was not a theologian. He was not a scholar or a diplomat or a man of particular social grace. He was stubborn and impractical, and he asked too many questions, and he stayed too long in places where sensible people didn't. He was also, by every account of every person who ever sat with him in a cold room or on a stone wall looking at mountains, someone in whose presence things became inexplicably more possible. That is a hard thing to explain. It is also a hard thing to forget once you have encountered it, even secondhand. The telegram said gone, but stories, the real ones, have a way of surviving the people who carried them. 30 years after a plumber's son from Hamilton walked into a remote Himalayan village with $40 and a question he couldn't stop asking, the question was still going. It still is.